Hi folks, Josh Knight the First here with another episode of Writer Rewind, coming to you with episode 5 of the series. Let's get right into it. So this week on Kamen Rider Geo, we're seeing a little bit more of the development of the characters, but we're also actually getting into a lot of action, and there's a reason for that because we've got a specific director who came back for this episode who's worked on several other Kamen Rider series. Now the theme of this episode is actually going to be a bit about friendship. It's not really at the forefront, but we get why it's there because of the tie-in to the specific rider power that we're getting this episode, which is related to Kamen Rider Heisei. The background idea that we're playing with in this episode is the idea that Sogo doesn't think that he has friends, or at least over the course of the episode he's considering what friendship is, or rather if he has any friendship to compare to. Now while all of this is going on, we see that we've been introduced to a new timejacker. This is a timejacker by the name of Schwartz. Now Schwartz is much taller than the other timejackers, he seems to have more power than the other timejackers, but I'm starting to consider what is it that makes the timejackers threatening other than the fact that they're able to go into the past and change things. They seem to have access to this ride watch technology, but they themselves aren't monsters, they're creating monsters. So what is it about them, about their physiology, that makes them so much of a threat? Well, for right now, they're not the exact threat, it's what they've made that's the threat, and that's another writer for this episode, another Heisei. Now, Kamen Rider Heisei, of course, ties back to the series, which started in 2011, which is actually when I started doing videos. Now, what we see here is that a lot of girls have been going missing from back since 2011, and they all seem to have something in common. They're all 18 years old and Libras. Now, it seems that while Tsukuyomi was investigating what this case was, where all of these girls have gone missing, she actually ran into Gentaro and didn't know it. Now, I think it's worth noting that the girl that's missing from Amanogawa High is somebody by the name of Hoshino Amane. Now, it's interesting to point out that the Hoshi in the kanji of the name and the Amane are both important. Hoshi being planet, the same kanji for planet, and the Ame like 10, which is another way of pronouncing that kanji, which means heaven, both of which are present and referring to celestial bodies, so that makes sense since Heisei was about space. Now I do have to give points to Sogo in this episode because he was able to quickly deduce, after Tsukuyomi had given him enough information, that the safest thing to do and the easiest thing to do would be to go straight to Amanogawa High, infiltrate, and figure out if they could find who the next victim would be. So good on Sogo for showing that he has critical thinking skills. That's growing his character more, and we're starting to see little bits and pieces of who he is. If he grows as a character in these first couple of episodes, that's what we're going to need to carry us through for the rest of the series. Now going along with the whole celestial bodies thing in space, we see that Woz shows up later on in the episode to confirm to Sogo that there's certain things going on, and this all relates back to a shooting star. That's the only bit of information that he can give him. What I think is interesting about that is, one, he's giving him that piece of information which might actually go a little bit deeper than we know, but two, it's actually pointing out that the information that Woz uses, the little book he carries around, seems to have that information altered or he can't read it, meaning that the things that the timejackers are doing in the past might actually be screwing stuff up and having a ripple effect. Kind of the same as if something from the future gets modified by something from the past. An example of this would be the movie Time Cop with Jean-Claude Van Damme, where if somebody got a scar in the past, the scar shows up in the future. Now from being there on the campus there in Amanogawa, they seem to figure out that the next victim is going to be Karen Yamabuki, who doesn't seem to be really special for any reason other than those two things. She's a Libra and she's 18. Now she's acting very weird in this episode. She's not really confronting things when asked questions. She's actually running towards the monster, towards the kaijin in this episode, and won't explain herself. And nobody actually stops to ask her these questions or say, hey, why aren't you answering? Really, because the focus on this episode is actually going to be on the action. Now there is another threat lurking in the background in the form of Masato Kusaka, a character from Kamen Rider Heisei, which is actually going to have more of a tie-in in next week's episode. But it's interesting to see that he's showing up here, another writer outside of his time, outside of his series, here and around. Usually they have to go to the writer, but here the writer's coming to them. But Kusaka creeping aside, we actually need to get into that first fight with Geo and Gates versus another Heisei. Now we see that another Heisei has the capability of those same astro switches that Heisei's base states would have. So things like rocket, things like rocket launcher on his leg, things like that, he has access to without actually having to really have a physical button to push, he just has to make the motion. Now during that fight we see that the build armor is used by Gates, and Gates is able to use the attack correctly, the way it was meant to be used in the series, and we see that he's a little bit more adept at things, but we don't understand just how much information that he has on the history of Kamen Riders. That would be the only thing that would differentiate him from Geo, because Geo has no idea who these guys were, and Gates obviously does. Now for what it's worth, this next part actually goes really quick in the episode because of one specific fact, that we weren't able to get our main character back from that series. Now, in Kamen Rider Heisei, the main character, Gentaro Kisaragi, was played by Sota Fukushi, who since then has gone on to a lot of big roles. His most recent movie, Bleach, is actually on Netflix right now, and he's there in the role of Ichigo. So really right now he's actually filming another movie and promoting another movie at the same time, so clearly he's got a busy schedule. And this is going to be our biggest stumbling block to getting people back, is that they're just busy. But it's interesting to show that here in Geo, we're actually using photos of the cast from that show, from Heisei, and they're using their likenesses there on screen. We're showing that clearly we're not using replacement characters. That was Gentaro, that is Sota Fukushi's likeness, that is Ryo Yoshizawa's likeness there as Meteor, as Ryusei there in the show. So I imagine that might be a setup for later on down the road they will show up. Maybe it was just a case of, hey, I'm busy right now, but I'd love to come back, since we see that Fukushi did come back for the last Movie War. Now, as a nice little nod to the past series, we see that there are two characters there from Movie War Ultimatum, which is a crossover between two different series, Heisei being the first part of that, and Wizard being the second part. In the Heisei part, this is actually the part where we see Gentaro has actually become a teacher and is looking after several students. The two students that we see there are the same students and the same actors from that movie. So we see now in the present day that the Kamen Rider Club has moved into an actual classroom, since now they don't have access to the rabbit base, the rabbit hutch, the moon base that they had there in the series, and we see that Mr. Osugi, the suspender guy from that series, is still the sponsor for the club. Now, for some reason, Osugi was given instructions by Gentaro in the past to go ahead and hand over a ride watch to the guys that would eventually show up. Now, I know this is a very quick way of getting to it, but it's also a quick way of saying, hey, look, we know that this is the way this is going, but we really need to focus on this other big action scene we put a lot of money into this week. So now with the ride watch and a little bit of information about when things happened before, like when the Kamen Rider Club was founded back in 2011, that gives them the clue they need to go ahead and head back there. But the interesting thing is, when you look at another Heisei, or really a lot of the Another Riders that we've seen up to this point, they have the name of the writer that they're imitating as well as the date on them. Really, all you have to do is look at the monster to know where you need to go. But for what it's worth, we just need to get back there, so fine, let's go ahead and head back to 2011. Now again, we're seeing something that we did see in the Exate episode, where we're dropped right in the middle of a battle that happened there in the episode, which would be one of the first fights between Heisei and the Scorpio Zodiarts, which is a fight that happened early on in the series before we knew the identity of the Scorpio Zodiarts. Now what we're seeing here is the person who is another Heisei was a kid who seemed to have some sort of weird power and was afraid of losing it. Schwartz showed up in the past, offered him more power, and turned him into another Heisei. Okay, we've got that out of the way now. What's interesting to see is actually the little bits and pieces that they're sewing in here, which will probably come to fruition next week, as to what exactly that power was. Seemingly going along with what he was trying to do to begin with, another Heisei actually uses the core switch, which belonged to the character Kengo Utahoshi there in Heisei, to go ahead and seemingly suck up the life energy from these girls that he's kidnapped. Now it's interesting that he's actually using a real core switch here and not something slightly different. But of course, now that Geo and Gates have shown up, it's time to throw down with another Heisei. And here is where the episode shines in the action for this particular episode, and there's a reason for that. If you've been watching Tokusatsu for a while, you might notice that there's very similar shooting styles, very similar angles and things that are used there, the wire work and the explosions that you might have seen in other episodes of Kamen Rider or even Super Sentai. The reason for that is the director for this episode, Mr. Koichi Sakamoto. Now Sakamoto is no stranger to Tokusatsu. He's directed Power Rangers, he's directed Kamen Rider, Super Sentai, a lot of different movies, and a lot of very action-packed things. You can normally tell when it's his episode when you see the wire work looking really crisp and clean and the explosions are very copious. And that makes sense for this particular fight because we see that because of Heisei's power, the ability to kind of boost up with the rockets, we need that wire work to be there. And we didn't necessarily need it for Gates doing a flip, but it's there and it looks clean. The cleaner it looks, the easier it is for suspension of disbelief. So this is definitely a Koichi Sakamoto joint this episode. What I do find interesting is right before Geo activates the Heisei ride watch, we see that Woe steps in to go ahead and defend him. Now I'm interested to see whether or not he actually becomes an active combatant later on down the line when the timeline seems to be thrown off that much more, which I imagine it will be. But for right now, he seems to have enough power to throw back the Another Riders, but again, he doesn't really want to mess with history. He wants to make sure that things stay on the path that they're on now. And of course, we get to the point that we've all been waiting for the debut of Kamen Rider Geo Heisei Ride Armor. Now here in this armor, we've gotten a little bit of a new power that's added to Heisei, which still makes sense for what he is. The armor can fold up into a rocket and propel Geo around like so. And now the thing of it is, the attack that Gio uses here at the end isn't messed up like the last 2 episodes, because we're kind of having to step things up here for whatever reason. The attack that he uses against another Heisei is actually the same attack that Heisei uses in movie War Ultimatum there at the end of the movie, the Kiriwami or spinning drill kick. And he's actually doing it the same where he's got both feet flat and drills into him there and seemingly would take care of him. But there's actually a monkey wrench thrown into things that we weren't expecting. Now, for all intents and purposes, for everything the show has told us, using the same writer's power against the same another writer should take them out, and it does seemingly do away with another Heisei's power. But what we didn't expect was that another Heisei kind of molts into another Heisei. It seems that person already had another ride watch put into them and just reverted back to the writer or another writer they already were. On top of that, we see that Kusaka has caught up to Tsukuyomi and Karen, but is put to the side and not left to choke her out by Takumi, the main character from Kamen Rider Heisei. This will actually lead us into next week's episode when it's a Heisei-oriented episode, and we're actually going to see what the heck they're doing there and what that ride watch was doing in that guy to begin with. So yeah, that's a lot to take in here, and I want to get through this as quickly as I can so that we can go ahead and get to the questions. But it's really interesting to see that they actually combined 2 different writers into this episode, and they're kind of woven in there a little bit more than you would think when you first look at it. First and foremost, I think it's nice that they did as much as they could for the Heisei portion without actually getting any of the main cast back. I mean, yeah, it's nice to see Osugi again, but it would have been nice to see another member of the Kamen Rider Club coming back, like JK, like anybody else we would have liked there. But for right now, it's nice that we at least got something. What's more interesting to me is the fact that one person can actually have 2 ride watches in them at the same time. That seems like something they would save for end boss stuff later on in several episodes down the road, like, oh, 1 ride watch wasn't good enough, let's try 2. And the thing of it is, the 2 powers didn't integrate into each other, it was just one covering the other. But the thing of it is, when you took one away, the other was still there intact. So I'm wondering what that had to do with the guy who was originally another Heisei. Basically what I'm saying is, if it's tying into the next episode, that guy may have in fact been an Orphanoch, which is one of the monsters from the series Kamen Rider Heisei. They were the main antagonists for that show. It's entirely possible that the power that he was trying to use earlier was the same way that Orphanochs try to spread themselves out in that series. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that there's a couple of things that are misleading there in the show, but actually tie the 2 together between Heisei and Heisei. Specifically that we've got 2 characters named Sonoda. If you look there in the box where the ride watch was being kept there in the Kamen Rider Club, there's a picture of Miss Sonata, which is one of the teachers there in Kamen Rider Heisei. Another character with that name, Mari Sonata, who's the main female character in Kamen Rider Heisei. The other thing I wanted to point out was the tie to the shooting star, or the Nagareboshi. Now, the way they're translating that shooting star, and the way that they relate that back to Ryusei, meteor, that all tying together, that makes sense if you're just looking at it from the Heisei portion. But if you actually go back a little further into Heisei, there's another way that ties in with the Ryuseiji, the school of people that are actually tied to trying to take down Smart Brain in that show. So maybe that's what Woz meant when he was trying to give Sogo that information. Really, this is a lot to take in here, and I'm interested to see just exactly what direction they take this in. It's taking a lot of work to tie in all of these different series together, and maybe I'm just doing their work for them and tying things together that they didn't really think about, but I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they've done this on purpose, and it's actually making for a more integrated experience, especially if you know all this information already about the series. But those, of course, are my thoughts on the episode. I want to hear what you guys thought in the comments below, so let's go ahead and talk about a few things. First off, Gates and Sogo. Just how long will it take for Gates to calm down and actually become Sogo's friend, or will he stay antagonistic with him for the better part of the series? Secondly, Schwartz. What makes him so much more powerful than Wool or Oda, or even Woz for that matter? We don't even know if they have matching abilities or capabilities, but what is it about him that's able to freeze the other Time Jackers? And thirdly, do you think that Sota Fukushi will show up later on in the series as Gentaro, maybe in a later episode or in a movie? You tell me in the comments below. And of course, during the week, you can always talk to me over on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JoshKnight1st. This has been episode 5 of Rider Rewind for episode 5 of Kamen Rider Geo, Switch On 2011. I'm Josh Knight the First. I'll see you guys again next episode.